guys, it's Kelly here, and I'm back with another video for Honeybee Stamps. Today is a long one. It's a long one. We're using lots of fall products. The fence, the apple barrel, the gourds, the mushrooms, the Lovely Layers sunflowers. Also some of the, I showed this one, but I didn't end up using it. I basically threw everything with the kitchen sink at this card, quite honestly. So anywho, before we get too far into the card, what I'm doing here is I just lay all of mine out. I like to Copic color my die cuts. So I just cut them all out of white. I just lay them out till I, play Tetris with it to try to get many to fit as I possibly can. Then I use big long pieces of tape to hold them in place. And then I'm only going to show you this one because there was a ton of die cutting. So Honeybee is having a flash sale today only, which is August 2nd. It's 20% off all of their fall products. That does not just mean stamps and dies and stencils, though all of those are in here, just like the ones I'm using today. But there's also like wax melts, there's glitter, there's embellishments, anything that falls into that fall category, either by color or by its use, is in the sale. So it's a really, really good one. If you were a big fan of my set, the set that I illustrated, what was it? Grateful Gatherings, I think is what it's called. That one is also 20% off, and anything that's in that category that is also on the clearance or retiring is an additional 20% off. So that 20% off affects all of it. So now let's talk about the card. There's lots to talk about. So here, after I do all of my die cutting, I go through my little cup here, my little holder, and I sort everything out so all of the pieces go with each other and I know what I have. I do leave the teeniest, tiniest pieces inside my little cup. So like the stems for the apples or for the gourds, those I left in the cup, just so I don't misplace them or they don't get blown around my desk because they are a bit on the smaller side. But what we're talking about is warm and cool colors today. So this is the fence, and there's going to be parts of this that are going to be sped up. The vast majority of this video is the coloring because each one of these die cuts is hand colored. So it takes a lot of time. What I like to do with my Lovely Layers is I lay the layers on top of my base layer. I take my lightest color and then I put a line for where the shadow is. Now on this fence, it's pretty obvious where the shadows are going to be because those crossbars, sit right there. But on some of the other ones, like the sunflower, it's not as obvious where the shading needs to go. So knowing that little trick of kind of tracing around the top layers is definitely helpful. So I'm just going to go in, and wherever those crossbars sit on top, we talk about, how we add shading where two things meet or where one object lays on top of the other. And so that's what we're doing here. These crossbars will sit on top, so they will cast a shadow. Now, for the browns that I chose here, this is the 70s family, and I'm specifically talking about the families in the Copic because that's what I'm using, but all like the warm and cool kind of information applies to all coloring mediums or colors. And basically, when you describe a color as warm or cool, it depends on how much like yellow or red is in it. So if you have a really warm color, red, yellow, orange, those are going to be, most people would say those are warm colors. Cool colors are going to be your blues, your purples, your greens are questionable. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So for this, with this particular brown, what makes a brown more cool or warm is how much yellow or red is in it, or how much blue or gray is added to it. So this one, this particular family, the 70s family, you can see this is sped up, by the way. I do not color this fast. but there's almost no red or yellow in it. It is a very cool color. And it's because I wanted the fence to look like it was old and it was weathered, like it had maybe been out in the weather for quite some time. So that is why I chose this color for it. Now, looking at the other things that I'm including in here, the apple barrel and the wagon, those are things that would also be traditionally brown, but we're not going to color them all in the same color family. So here, once I get out to my lightest color and everything's kind of filled in, I still want it to look like wood. So in order to enhance that wood look, I'm going to go back in with my darkest color, and I'm going to very lightly, I'm not putting any pressure at all. I am letting it skip wherever it wants to skip. I'm just kind of tracing the lines that are there with the embossing that the Lovely Layers give. So these lines are already there. You can see them, embossed into the paper. I know it's hard on camera, but I'm just following the same lines that are already there with the darkest color. And again, just letting it skip wherever it wants. You can already see this, this wood fence is coming to life just with that. I'm going to do the same thing for the crossbars. And then to just help it blend a little bit, I'm going to go over those same lines with the 74. So I skipped the 77. I'm going to go over with the E74, and then I'm also going to just kind of like retrace those lines so that way I have different tones that will have them blending in together and looking like a real wood fence. The Lovely Layers are so well done. This is really easy to achieve with these types of dies. And then I'm just going to glue on my crossbars, and that is going to be our fence. Now, real talk, by the time I get done throwing everything in its mother at this card, you can barely even see this fence. But I would like to include all of the things that I colored because, maybe you just picked up the wood fence or maybe you just picked up the wagon wheel. So now for the wagon wheel, I'm going in with the E40s family. This is still on the cooler side, but it definitely has more warmth than that E70s family that we just looked at. And I will give you a comparison of them like next to each other. So in the wagon wheel, you have like the wood joints that's what you see me adding the shading to. And then I'm also adding the shading just around the inside of the wheel on both pieces, on the pieces with the spokes and the outer wheel. And then, just doing just like one little flick or two into the spokes because they're inset. Like they would be set inside the outer wheel, so they would have more of a shadow. And then for the inside, I just basically filled it in with that darker color. So now I'm going to go in with my mid-tone and extend those out, go over that darkest color and then extend out the shading just a little bit so we have some lighter areas. And then the same thing for the spokes. Now, if you want your colors to blend well, I highly recommend going over your darkest color with your mid-tone and then your mid-tone with your lightest color. Basically, whatever color you have down, if you go back over it, it will help them to blend together. So you're kind of like swooping over the darker color and extending it out with its next color. Just like here with this wheel, like I'm kind of going back and forth between them to help them blend together. And then the other thing with the Lovely Layers, or any sort of layering dies, you want to make sure that you're not leaving, if you're coloring them in white like I do, that you're not leaving a white edge, because then when you put them together, you run the risk of seeing that white edge and it kind of ruins the facade of it looking realistic. For the inside, like the spoke that holds the spokes on, I don't even know what we call this. What are we going to call this? Like a nut or a washer kind of thing. Normally I would tell you in between colors to make sure that you clean up your work surface, but in this case I left the brown on purpose so that I could pick it up with my cooler grays and kind of incorporate it so that it would look like there was maybe some rusty spots, or that there was some dirt on it, to make it look a little bit more aged. So now I'm going to go ahead and adhere those together. And then once I put these on, I realized pretty quickly that I had left them too light, that the metal portion of it was just not looking the way that I wanted it to look. So after they're adhered, I'm just going to go back in with my C5. You'll see me picking up some of that brown, and then I'll blend it back out with the C3, and I was much happier with that. For the apple barrel, this is actually the first time that I've used it, but it's so stinking cute. Basically, I'm going to now switch to the E50s family. And you're going to see when I put this color down how much warmer it is than the last two browns that we've used. And that's because it has more yellow in it. This isn't even the warmest brown, but you can very easily see how we have these different tones of browns, and one of them is completely different from another. Now, if you're a person who's shopping on a budget, like I frequently am, you can buy like a middle of the road one. You could do the 50s family or the 40s family. And then you could add more warmth to it by going over it with a warmer color, like an orange or a yellow or even a red, depending upon what shade it was. Or you could make them cooler by going over it with a blue or a purple or a cool gray. So these are just some things that you can do to kind of stretch your markers if you don't have all of them. But that is why when you look at like alcohol markers, and it doesn't matter which brand, the vast array that you see for the browns, even though browns are not that exciting, it's because there's so many different tones for them. So here for the apple barrel, this is the inside. Again, this is one of those things that I'm showing you how to color it in case you want to learn, but you will not see any of that back portion. You'll see the front, but you're not going to see any of the back portion because we're going to fill it full of autumn goodies. So for the shading, again, it has that band around the center. So we're, going to have shading kind of coming up from there, just like we did with the crossbar on the fence. And then I also added, just a little bit of darkness to all of what would be the separate slats of the barrel. And then for the edge on both of them, I am leaving a darker edge, like where it comes up to the outside, and then a lighter edge where it's like right, how do I explain that? Like where the boards come up and meet, like the top of the barrel, you would have a lighter edge. So consequently, the width of the wood, like where you can see that, would be a little bit darker for it to make sense. So now we have that all done. We're doing the same thing with the wood that we did with the fence because I think that it's really helpful to help it kind of come to life. For the band in the center, for the flat one, I just went with a darker brown, just enough to kind of blend in with that shadow. And then for the one that actually has the accents on it that look like metal accents that you would see like holding a barrel together in real life, I am going to use some cool grays for that. Using cool and warm colors together. Now, you don't want to be like crazy, and there's a lot in this card. Like, if you would have told me, if you would have been like, oh, this is a Kelly Taylor card, I would have been like, nah, I don't see it. That doesn't really track. That's a lot of layers and a lot of die cuts. So really, I'm just as surprised as you are, honestly. But there were so many just like fun things to use. Something to note here. If you're going to fill your little barrel with all kinds of goodies, make sure you don't put adhesive at the top so that you can still slide the other die cuts down inside there. But anyway, using warm and cool colors together can create a lot of interest. So now here is all three of them together. We have our warm apple barrel, our more neutral kind of wagon wheel, and then a very cool fence. And you can see all like the difference between them. So while I have my desk covered in brown, I'm going to go ahead and color other brown elements that I need. So this is the inside of the sunflower. And I just kind of followed like this. It has like a little bit of a swirl pattern that's embossed into it. So for the base layer, I just kind of followed that. And then this part that I'm showing you, again, I'm using the E50s family because I know that they're going to be part of a visual triangle that I'm creating on my card. But I end up going much, much darker once I have the rest of the flower colored because this was just too light. However, I did go in and create some stippling. So it has the embossed sections of like all the different areas. But I wanted to create more visual texture, so I'm using the stippling, which is just a small series of dots, to create that. So working from my darkest color out to my lightest midtone is going to create that look of texture for me, or like the little seeds that you would see in a sunflower. These are the cattails, and I'm going to be honest with you, I colored them upside down. I thought, like, adding the darkness, I thought that was the bottom, but it wasn't. It was the top. It ended up being fine. I did not redo it because, well, honestly, everything is fixable, and does it really make that big of a difference with this card that has so much going on? No, it doesn't. So this is, again, the E50s family because it's part of that visual triangle that I'm going to be creating on my card. So a lot of this towards what I thought was the bottom is darker, and then I leave a little bit of a highlight at the top. If you ever have trouble blending your darker colors, just go back over it with the midtone and it should help blend out anything that is looking a little wonky. Here, I picked a cool green and then I did the stems for that. And then we're going to move on to the mushrooms. For the mushrooms, I chose to do a warm gray. And warm grays tend to look more brown, which is why I traditionally am more, I guess, personally, I prefer cool grays. But in this case, because there's so much, there's so many other warm colors, I thought that they made the most sense. And I'm just doing the same thing that I showed you guys before, laying down all the layers, using the lightest color to just kind of mark out where they're going to be. For something like this little mushroom, it's obvious where the end is, but for the other ones, it's a little bit more tricky. For the stem of this one, I could see in the embossing that it had a couple of different layers, so I chose to add my shading to that. And then the underneath of the mushroom is quite kind of like, it looks streaky in terms of coloring, like when you're looking at them, because there's a lot going on as it kind of grows up and its mushroom top, kind of blooms out. But so back to the conversation at hand, if you will, the warm and cool colors. The reason that purples and greens are kind of tricky and not everybody agrees on if they're warm or cool colors is because they can go one way or the other. So if you have like a true green, it's definitely going to have more blue tones in it. If you have a yellow green, that's going to be warmer because it has the yellow in it. If you have a blue green that is, like your traditional teal, that's definitely on the cooler side. Same thing with the purples. Like if you have a purple that, has blue undertones, it's definitely going to look a lot different than a purple that has pink or red undertones. And so for one of these mushrooms, I'm going to color them all red. That's what you're going to see me do here. All their little caps are going to be red. But this smaller one here, I'm going to go over it with a purple to kind of cool it down. Now, I already prefer a cool red combination. That's what you're seeing here. But you could do a warm red combination and have it be more like tomato red, like a red orange. That would be much warmer than this. So there's so much variation in that, and that can really, you can use that to your advantage to create interest in your cards. I'm going to tell you, if I had to make this card all over again, would I include all of the elements that I did today? Probably not, because looking at it, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's just so much. There's so much going on, and I'm not a busy card person, but I can appreciate it when other people do layers, just maybe not so much for myself. So here, I tried a pink to see if that would give me the purple that I wanted, but it wasn't. So I needed to kind of tip it more toward that raspberry color. I needed to go for a darker purple. And then these layer up super easy. This big one goes on to the one that has a small one, and then they both go on to their stems. Even, see, do you see here? Even I forget sometimes that you have to like color the outside edge. Thankfully, I remembered before I glued it together. But otherwise, you would be able to see that kind of glaring white edge from the side, and it would not look right. So try to remember, if you're going to be doing your own coloring, whether it's with alcohol markers or colored pencils or watercolor or whatever you're doing, if you're coloring die cuts, try to remember to get the sides and the edges, because it really does help. And then, because I can't ever leave anything alone, even when I have a card that has 100 million items on it, that might be a slight dramatization. But I will, at the end, I will add some white kind of polka dots and stuff to, really bring these mushrooms around. They're so cute. They're like the cutest little size. So for the apples, we're using this same cool red where it kind of would sink in where the stem would be. I'm adding some dark shadows, and then where I don't really know what you call the little bumps on an apple. I think of them as feet. Like where the little feet are, I'm adding some shadows. And then I'm going to do one that has more of a center highlight, one that has a left highlight, and one that has a right. So that's where you see me adding those darker colors to. This one right here is going to be the one that has the center highlight. So I'm going to add a little bit of shading to the top and the bottom. For this one, the highlight will be on the left-hand side, so the vast majority of the shading is going to be on the right. And then for this one, the shading is on the left and the highlight will be on the right. And you could leave this with that super white highlight if you wanted to. I'm going to fill mine in with a little bit of a lighter color, which is the R32, just because I feel like it works really well to kind of soften it all. But if for some reason you feel like it softens your R35 a little too much, you can always go back in with the R35 and re-add it. And that's true for any of these. If you feel like your lightest color kind of bleached out your shading a little too much, you can always go back in and re-add it. So now we're on to the rest of the sunflower that we had not done before. And I stacked them all up. I used my lightest color to trace them out. And this one is one of those ones, remember back in the wagon wheel when I was talking about how if you want your colors to blend really well, you need to kind of go over the whole thing. This is one of those color combinations that this rings true for. And just bear with me. I'm going to realize I'm half off screen in just a second here. So I'm using an E99, which is a super warm brown, very, very warm brown. And then a YR24 and a Y08 and a Y02. And this is going to give us a really pretty golden yellow. So adding the shading on the top layer, I'm really just using the darkest color to kind of give some shape to the middle of it. For the other ones, you'll notice that it looks really, really brown. And that's because as the petals go back, they're going to have less light on them. And so they will be darker. So that would make sense. But the way that you get this combination to work really well and look like a golden yellow is when you get to the section that is for the Y08, you have to go over the whole thing. You have to add that yellow, that warmth into those browns for them to make sense together. And then I also chose to do all of my outlining in this shade, in this yellow one. And you'll see there's a couple of petals on the back that have, some white tips, and there's a couple of petals in the middle for the top layer. We're going to leave white tips on all of them because that's what we're going to fill in with our Y02. And again, just to help them blend better within the fibers of the paper, add moisture and help them to, do their thing. We're going to go over all of the colors. And then I'm just kind of lining them up as I go so that I can check and make sure all of my shadows line up the way that they're supposed to. And I'm happy with that. Here is where I realized very quickly that this was not dark enough. So I'm going to go back in with my darkest brown in that E50s family, and then the mid-tone, and then to warm it up some, I went back in with that E99, which is actually the darkest color that we use to shade the petals. And I went over the whole thing. And can you see how much warmer it looks now? I think like that was a good move because we have some of those warm elements, you know, that we're trying to make that visual triangle with. Here, I'm just flipping this this center around. Usually, I end up having good luck if I find a point that is pretty distinct and it's on all of the layers. So for like this flower, there's this one on the left that's like an extra little pointy, and that's what I'm looking for in order to line them up, is that super pointy one that's hanging out there. And then that is the sunflower completed. From here, we're going to move on to coloring our greenery. So we have this warmer yellow green that we're going to use. And then we're also going to use a cooler green. This is like when we're talking about putting bouquets together and creating interest with various colors of your greenery. That's a lot to do with it, is the warmer and the cooler colors. And there's ways that, again, you can kind of use them to do both so that they work nicely together. And once this is the yellow green version, this honestly is like my go-to color combination is a YG 67, 17, 03, and an 01. That's really the combination that I like personally. And if I'm going to sit down and put a card together, you're almost guaranteed to see this combination on it. But the other one that I really like is a G29, G19, and a G07, and we'll talk about why. So here, coloring the gourds, I'm going to do this one with a little bit of red. So I'm using a cooler red, but by going over it with the orange, it's going to warm it up to that kind of tomatoey red that we talked about. And then I'm going to bring in more orange, like the full set of orange for the one that looks more like a pumpkin. I'm going to color it like a pumpkin. And when you're coloring, you might have heard me say, like, you need to decide if you're a person who flicks away from yourself or towards yourself. And I'm a person who flicks away from myself, and you're going to see why in this little clip right here. Do you see how uneven my flicks are when I'm flicking towards myself? It's like I'm so uncomfortable with it. But why do I keep trying to do it? Like, do you know what I'm saying? I'm like, but you know that you don't like the way that looks. Why do you keep trying to make that work, girl? Like, just learn your lesson. So I finally did, and I flipped it around. And then I worked out to this light orange, this YR04. But then to really brighten it up, again, we're really warming it up by adding in more of that yellow. So now it looks almost like a fire versus just, you know, looking for orange. Here's that green combination I was talking about. And I'm going to use it to color this particular squash or gourd. And it's definitely more blue, but because we're going to put this into the basket with the cool reds and the warm oranges, it's going to create a contrast, not just because red and orange are complementary colors, but because the tones are different. And so it makes them look really nice with each other. Here, all I'm doing is I'm taking the darkest color and I'm doing the same thing I did with the wood. I'm just kind of following along some of those embossed lines to give it a little bit more detail. Same thing here. I chose the darker orange to just follow along some of those lines and add that detail. The stems, I just, for the most part, I just colored brown just like I did with the apple. The only exception to that was the pumpkin. I did add a little bit of green into that and then blended it out. For these flowers, I'm using that same green combination. And I did just want to mention the G07 does tend to lean a little bit more yellow-green, but not so much so that it's warm, but it makes them look nice together. For these flowers, remember how we did that like raspberry kind of mushroom? We're going to do these raspberry colored flowers. Again, these are on the cooler side, so they're going to create a nice contrast next to that really warm yellow and really warm orange. So once those are done, I did go in back with that same kind of purple color that I used on the mushroom and just kind of gave them a once over. And then these ones are super easy to put together. There's just the 2 little blooms that go right on there. Originally, I thought I was only going to use 3 of them, but I actually ended up using all 4. I just kind of changed the way, like their orientation. So gluing those together, really happy with the way those looked. So now here you can see all of this coloring that we've done, but now we have to do a background for it. Now, I know, and you know, we're not going to see much of this background, not with all the things we just colored. So I'm just doing a super simple, using the large background brush from Honeybee, super simple sky. So some light blues, leaving some open areas for some clouds. And then using another large background brush with the mowed lawn for the bottom. Then I can start assembling this. So the first thing to go down is the fence, which I promise you're going to see so little of. You're going to wonder why I spent all that time coloring it. But to be fair, 1, I really enjoy coloring, and 2, I had no idea that that's how it was going to turn out in the end. And I'm a completist, so I like to see them all completely colored, even if I know I'm not going to use them in their entirety completely colored. For the grass, normally I do tend to go more towards a yellow-green, but I chose to go with the cooler greens, like a more true green, because I'm going to have so much warmth up front with this little basket. I've basically kind of prearranged my pumpkins and squash and apples in this barrel, and now I'm just kind of holding them there and adding little bits of glue so that they will be secure enough that I can move them as one whole piece. So if you've ever watched any of my videos before, you know I typically like to lay out my whole card, and then I kind of glue and pick up areas until I have huge areas already put together. So I'm going to glue down this sunflower leaf. I thought about doing a stem, honestly, but then it was just like one more thing in the background that I didn't need because you couldn't even tell that the sunflower was attached to it. So now here I'm going to do the sunflower in this top right corner with that warm center, those cool little fuzzy flowers create a really nice contrast. We have the warmer brown up in the top. And then here down at the bottom, we have the wagon wheel that's going to be more kind of like center left. And then the warm apple crate there. So you can see how that cool green really kind of shows up in comparison to the warmer colors that are in the bucket. It really kind of draws you in. And then here's where I decided that I was going to, originally I was just going to cut off the flower. And then I was like, maybe I can rework it. So I ended up cutting it off kind of right where the leaves were. And then I reattached it down to a shorter leaf so that I would be able to keep it. This gives me 5 elements of that raspberry color, the mushroom, and then the 4 flowers. And we know that in design, working in odd numbers is more pleasing to the eye, because if you work in even numbers, your brain tries to pair them. So I have then 5 of those kind of cooler purple elements. I have 5 of the cooler red elements. The oranges and the yellows kind of work with each other, and then we have a nice mix of greens. So here, this was the only mushroom I had to trim. He just hung over there just a little too far, so I just trimmed him off. And then for the sentiment, which this set is also on sale, and it's a really great one, this is the Heartfelt Hello. It says, my favorite color is autumn. And I white heat embossed that with our Brilliant White pigment ink onto craft. popped it up on a little bit of foam tape, and then now we're going to do just the final little touches. There's so much going on in this card. I don't know if I love it or not, but I'm happy for the experience. So I added just some highlights, like I said, to the mushrooms, to the like nails in the wheel, things like that. I didn't add any shimmer, shockingly, but I think we learned a lot. So I hope this was helpful to you. Don't forget to check off that 20% off sale. That is tonight only, just for August 2nd. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I always appreciate your time, and I will catch you on the next video. Bye.